why do you include 1080p and 4K results? These cards are made for 1440p gaming. If you want a 4K card, you're gonna need a 4080, 4090, 5080, or 5090, guys. I see a lot of comments like this, and I'm not really trying to make fun of it. It's just that there's, it used to be the case that you should choose your graphics card based on your monitor resolution, and that was by far the most important thing. However, we're living in an age where resolution is much less important than it has ever been in the past. It's not completely unimportant. But check this out, for example. So this is running on an RTX 5070, less powerful than the GPUs that person was responding to. This is the Gigabyte Gaming OC RTX 5070 running at its out-of-the-box settings. I want you to notice something. At 1440p native resolution, this GPU is only hitting in the mid-40s. We're at about 47 FPS right now. Whereas at 4K max settings, but using DLSS performance, we're getting 63 FPS. The performance is actually better. Also, watch as I zoom in here. Which of these actually looks better? Now, there's going to be some YouTube compression, and this is a dark scene, but I'm trying to zoom in here just to show you guys if you're on a lower resolution display and things like that. But I would argue that the 4K DLSS performance mode has noticeably more detail, is more stable in motion, and it's running at a significantly higher frame rate. Now, its internal rendering resolution using DLSS performance mode is actually only 1080p rather than 1440p, but because it's using DLSS's upscaling algorithm, it can reconstruct more detail than a native 1440p with TAA implementation is giving you. So that is pretty interesting results. Also, in addition to upscalers making monitor resolution a little more wishy-washy compared to what it used to be, we also have monitors that literally have dual modes and switch between various resolutions. For example, I use a 4K monitor that can switch into like an esports 1080p mode, and check this out. So many people are making a huge mistake on their PC build by not thinking enough about the monitor that you will actually be viewing all of the content on. And the good news is that while much of the PC hardware space has stagnated like GPUs, the monitor space has been incredibly exciting, with high-end specs and features that used to cost thousands just a few years ago now available at extremely affordable pricing. KTC is leading that charge with their mission of offering monitors with better specs than competitors at the same price, or same specs at a better price. Either way, the consumer wins, and a huge thanks to KTC for sponsoring this part of today's video. For example, check out the M27P6. It has a dual switch between 4K and 1080p. At 4K, it supports 160 Hz, which combined with its amazing HDR 1400 certification, thanks to its mini LED technology, 2 millisecond response times, and 98% DCI-P3 coverage, makes it perfect for the latest AAA graphical showcases. And its 1080p 320 Hz mode is a perfect fit for the most intensely competitive esports. I love that the 27-inch size still works great for both use cases without 1080p getting too blurry or too big for serious esports use, while the 4K mode has an incredible pixel density that larger 4K displays lack. The KTC M27P6 really is perfectly suited for all of my use cases. The 4K resolution and 97% Adobe RGB coverage is perfect for my video editing and productivity work with no fear of OLED burn-in, and its USB-C connection can even charge my laptop through the 65-watt power delivery, while also transmitting the DisplayPort alt mode signal. The included stand is incredibly adjustable, even able to 90-degree pivot into portrait mode, which is great for coding, browsing, or secondary display use running Stream Chat or Discord. Seriously, the value on offer here is almost hard to believe, but there really is no catch. KTC has actually been the manufacturer behind some of the top displays from the biggest brands for many years, but starting in 2021, they've been offering their own gaming monitors directly to consumers under their own KTC branding to enable trend-setting, leap-forward technologies in never-before-seen price segments. Check the link in the video description and/or pinned comment to get the KTC M27P6 now. So let's do a little more exploration of this RTX 5070 running at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, but we're also just going to look at not just native resolution, but also what if you're using upscalers and changing graphic settings, because I think that unfortunately graphics card reviews, let me get myself out of the way here and hit play on this, I think graphics card reviews have kind of misinformed some people, not on relative performance, which is what they're trying to do, but on how well a card can actually perform. Graphics card testing is usually done at native resolution and oftentimes at maximum graphics settings, and oftentimes lower settings aren't tested at all. The idea here is to make sure that you are GPU limited and you're stressing the GPUs as much as possible so you can measure their relative performance against other GPUs. And here we can see that the 5070 in a big Unreal Engine 5 game like Clair Obscur Expedition 33 at 1080p is only a little over 60 FPS. At 1440p it's only in the mid 40s, and at 4K it's only in the mid 30s. So you might conclude that this is really only a 1080p GPU. But if we use appropriate resolution scaling here at 1080p, we're saying at max settings on all of these for now. We'll also look at reduced settings. But using DLSS quality at 1080p with the newer DLSS models actually looks very usable, and in some cases better than a native TAA implementation. 1440p DLSS balanced works very well now, and 4K even DLSS performance mode can work super well. Notice that 4K DLSS performance mode at max settings is now over 60 FPS. 1440p DLSS balanced is now around 80, and 1080p max with DLSS quality is around 90. So actually, if you had a 1080p, 1440p, or 4K display paired with this GPU, you can run the game at max settings with just resolution scaling coming in here. I really want to emphasize this. You could be on a 4K display running DLSS performance mode at around 60 FPS, or you could be running at 1080p max settings at native TAA. And if you're on a 4K display right now, which you might not be, and we'll zoom in on it in a second, I think you can tell which of these looks better. If you're on a phone screen right now, you can pinch to zoom, or if you're on a lower res display, this might not come across as much. And remember, there's also YouTube compression eating up some of the detail that you actually get in that 4K image that I'm seeing in person here. But there is significantly more detail on the right-hand side of the screen, despite these running at essentially the same frame rate. Let me try zooming in a bit here to help those of you who are on the lower resolution displays. Again, some people criticize the zooming in to show differences, but that's if you're not on a 4K display, you can't see 4K resolution. So by 2x zooming in per axis, you're actually now seeing you're actually able to see all of the pixels on the 4K image if you're watching on a 1080p display, for example. So you can actually truly see the differences. There is significantly more detail on the right-hand side of the screen, significantly less shimmering of elements in the background and things like that. So it's a noticeably better experience and running at, again, about the same frame rate, which is pretty interesting. But let's also note, again, the difference between 1440p and 4K, because as my commenter had suggested, these are just 1440p GPUs, you can't really use them at 4K. Well, again, if you're thinking in terms of native resolution, you might actually determine that these aren't even good. The 5070 is not even good enough for 1440p. Here we're getting in the mid 40 FPS range if we're trying to play at a native 1440p, whereas using 4K max settings with DLSS performance mode is over 60 FPS. And once again, if your monitor resolution is high enough to see it, I will argue that the 4K DLSS performance mode actually looks significantly better than 1440p native TAA. Now, again, here I'm using a 2x zoom to show it, and it's not going to be as drastic of a difference as we saw from the 1080p and the 4K images. And again, YouTube compression does kind of kill some of it. But it is a noticeably sharper image on the right-hand side of the screen, despite the fact that it's running at a higher frame rate as well. Now, also note that 4K DLSS performance mode is using 1080p input resolution to reconstruct that 4K output, whereas the 1440p is using 1440p to just get a 1440p output. But again, upscaling algorithms like DLSS and FSR4, which I'm not focusing on in this video, are just getting really, really good. Now, another thing we should note when talking about is a GPU good enough for a certain monitor resolution is the fact that you don't need to play a game at maximum settings. In a game like Clair Obscur Expedition 33, the medium settings look extremely close to the maximum settings, but you gain a huge amount of performance. And if we also pair that with the appropriate levels of DLSS here, notice that we're now well over 100 FPS on 1080p and 1440p, and only slightly under 100 FPS on the 4K image. Again, we're averaging around 93 right now. And again, I actually, there's a good argument for the image on the right being the best because it does reconstruct the most detail. Now, what if we're going into a game that is just famous for being completely unoptimized? How about Monster Hunter Wilds, which again has been judging by sales, one of the biggest releases on PC this year, and actually in quite a while. The performance is a bit rough. Again, on an RTX 5070, a $550 graphics card just released this year, actually came out after the game did, I think. You might assume if you're judging by native resolution that this is only a 1080p GPU if you're stuck on native resolution and maximum settings, where it is over 60 FPS. Whereas at 1440p max settings at native resolution, you're well under 60 FPS, only in kind of the low 50s. And at 4K max settings, native resolution, you're barely over 30 FPS. So again, if you're going by that more old school way of thinking about it, where you're stuck on your specific native resolution output, you would certainly not want to be pairing the 5070 with really anything above 1080p here, especially if you're stuck on that must be at ultra settings mentality, right? But what if we do go ahead and kick on the upscaling? So by kicking on upscaling, we now are still at max settings otherwise. The 1080p results are now hitting pretty high frame rates, not, amazingly high, but good. But even the 4K results are just falling a bit short of the 60 FPS line. Now, they're still not hitting 60 FPS, so you still might want to turn some things down a bit here. The 1440p results are now over 60 FPS. So again, I also want to make sure in this video that I'm not coming across as just saying everybody should buy a 4K display. As you can see here, it's a lot easier to scale up the frame rates at max settings on the lower resolution displays, but you can use a more aggressive upscale setting at the 4K output. To make sure we all understand here that by changing these internal rendering resolutions, 1080p DLSS quality is internally rendering at about 720p, but then trying to reconstruct a 1080p looking image. 1440p DLSS balanced, I believe, is about 835p, so it's a bit higher than the DLSS quality on 1080p, and 4K DLSS performance is at 1080p resolution internally. So you're still using more resolution on that 4K output, but again, you can get by with those more aggressive DLSS settings because you are still having more pixels to work with. Now again, by also just turning down graphics settings, here we're looking at going to medium settings, we're seeing that we can actually now hit a very acceptable playable experience on all three monitor resolutions using the RTX 5070. With our 1080p medium with DLSS quality hanging around 100 FPS, it does dip below it as we get into the more difficult parts of this benchmark pass. 1440p medium using DLSS balanced, we're generally hanging out in the 80s. And 4K medium DLSS performance is near 70 FPS, but not quite there. But it's absolutely giving us over a 60 FPS average on a 4K display using that. And I do want to stress that none of my testing in this video is relying on frame generation. This is real frames. If you want to call anything fake here, it's fake resolution. But I mean, look at the details. You do see 4K worth of pixels on the right-hand side of the screen, despite the reconstruction from a 1080p internal rendering resolution. So you are seeing vastly more detail on the 4K display, and 1440p is seeing more detail than the 1080p display. But again, let's check out some other comparisons here. I think that this might be interesting. So another way that GPU reviews could be looked at is, so what if you targeted the same frame rate? At what sort of settings can you get? Now, there's a reason why GPU reviews don't really focus on this, because realistically, how do you choose the optimal graphic settings for any given GPU to hit a certain frame rate at a certain resolution? So this is a completely unrealistic thing, and I don't even want to claim that the settings choices I made here are perfect, but it is interesting to note that just trying to play the game at 1080p maximum settings at just a native TAA hits basically an identical frame rate to playing at 1440p max settings using DLSS balanced. and about the same frame rate as we're getting at 4K medium settings using DLSS performance. So all of these are giving you over 60 FPS, and despite the 4K option being turning down some actual graphics settings, watching it on a 4K display, I can certainly appreciate the additional pixel density and detail that I'm getting in the image. Again, I'm not saying it's the optimal choice, but it is a very realistic choice. And again, no frame generation is being relied on at this point. Let's check out another one of the most demanding and quite popular games released in 2025. This is Oblivion Remastered, which puts an Unreal Engine 5 graphics layer onto the old Oblivion Elder Scrolls game. If you hear giggling in the background, it looks like my daughters have come down into the area. We'll finish up filming. Anyway, at 1080p max settings using native TAA, we actually can't even hit 60 FPS average. 1440p max is down in the upper 30s, and 4K max is in the 20 FPS range and is probably going over 12 gigabytes of VRAM because we're getting some really bad 1% lows here. So here you might even conclude a 5070 is not even a 1080p GPU. If we go ahead and go to DLSS quality though, at otherwise maxed out settings, the 5070 is now handling things pretty well. And while I'm not doing the side-by-side of the native TAA versus DLSS quality, girls, maybe tune down the giggles just a little bit for me filming. Anyway, we are getting the, completely lost my train of thought. We are getting the, like I said, I think the DLSS quality actually looks better than the native TAA if I did put those up side by side. 1440p max DLSS balance is now around 60 FPS, but again, trying to go up to that 4K does mean sometimes you gotta turn down settings besides just resolution scaling, where we're still only hitting about 50 FPS there. Now, if we do turn down graphic settings, realistically, I'm probably turning them way further down than I really needed to by going to medium settings, and I'm also turning off the hardware-based lumen and using the software-based lumen. We're now at 1080p medium DLSS quality, closing in over 140 FPS. 1440p medium settings with DLSS balanced, we're well over 120 FPS. And even on a 4K display, we can be close to 90 FPS using DLSS performance with medium graphic settings. Realistically, I probably would have turned some settings higher, and depending on your preferences regarding frame generation, you can kick that on as well. Here, I am choosing not to use any frame generation. Let's look at another demanding game released in 2025. This is Doom: The Dark Ages, which famously requires ray tracing. You can't turn it off. Here, rather than call it max settings, I'm using Ultra Nightmare because there has been a path tracing mode released now, so I'm not showing path tracing here. But at otherwise maxed out settings besides path tracing, 1080p native, around 100 FPS, 1440p native, around 70, and 4K native, around 40 FPS. Kicking on DLSS at appropriate settings to the monitor resolutions, 1080p is now closer to 130 FPS. 1440p is now over 100 FPS, and even 4K Ultra Nightmare settings, but DLSS performance is now in the upper 70s. So giving a good experience again on every single monitor. And again, this is at max settings besides the path tracing modes, which are really more appropriate for ultra high-end GPUs. Now, if you also turn down to medium settings, this game doesn't gain quite as much performance by going from Ultra Nightmare to medium as we've seen in some of the other games going from max to medium, probably because Ultra Nightmare wasn't the true maximum settings, path tracing is. But here we're still now getting the 4K results up into the mid-80s, and the 1440p results are well over 100 FPS here, close to 120, and 1080p results are close to 140. One of the most demanding games released this year has been Assassin's Creed Shadows, where we see 1080p max settings using native resolution only in the mid-40s. We see 1440p max settings actually often around 40 FPS or even a little bit below, depending on the exact point we're at in the benchmark. And 4K max settings are below 30 FPS. So here again, if you're stuck on max settings native resolution, you might conclude that the RTX 5070 isn't even a 1080p GPU in this game. But again, we don't need to be holding on to native resolution and maximum settings. So here, this is a long benchmark run, so I'm skipping forward a bit. We're going to get to 1080p max settings, 1440p max settings, 4K max settings, but now using DLSS. So DLSS quality gets our 1080p results up close to 60 FPS now. Still falls a bit short. I've noticed that this game doesn't respond as well to resolution scaling as a lot of others do. I was trying to look into that, by the way, and it seems like from what I can tell, certain parts of the simulation in this game are being calculated on the GPU, and those things are not scaled by monitor resolution. So that is, or by internal rendering resolution. So I think that's one reason why this game is less sensitive to resolution changes, which is just kind of an interesting side note. But anyway, 1440p is now a bit under 60 FPS, 1080p is close to 60 FPS, and 4K is actually only a little under 50 FPS. Like I said, not a huge difference in rendering resolutions here. Even dropping to medium settings, though, and turning off a lot of the ray tracing, now we can boost frame rates quite a bit, but there's actually still not huge differences between the resolution itself and the frame rate targets. Again, apologies for all the giggling in the background here. 1080p medium DLSS quality, we're over 100 FPS now. 1440p medium DLSS balanced is still right around 100 FPS, and 4K medium DLSS performance is not too far behind in the upper 80s, close to 90 FPS range. Let's check out Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Now here at maximum settings, these settings are considered experimental in this game, so really maybe not the settings you would really try to use, but at 1080p you can get around 60 FPS. At 1440p max settings we're around 50, and at 4K max settings we're around 30 FPS. Now, kicking on DLSS gets us to around 70 FPS, mid-60s, and around 50 FPS. On the various display resolutions, so actually playable on all of them, although once again, 4K is a little bit hard to max out the game with your only concession being resolution scaling. However, if we drop to medium settings in this game, we're suddenly getting an extremely high refresh rate experience. 1080p medium DLSS quality, we're over 220 FPS. 1440p medium DLSS balanced, we're at 180. And 4K medium DLSS performance, we are around 115. Now, I do want to mention, though, that sometimes VRAM can be an issue at higher resolutions. Girls, can you be a little bit quieter, please? At 1080p max settings, we're around 70 FPS. Things seem okay, but at 1440p, things drop into the mid-40s, and at 4K plummets to 20 FPS. This is in Spider-Man 2 with everything cranked up, including ray tracing. Now, here's a case where resolution scaling is not going to solve VRAM issues at 4K. So going to DLSS, 1080p is now around 100 FPS. 1440p monitor with DLSS balanced is averaging in the mid-70s, but at 4K max settings, DLSS performance, we're in the mid-30s. So again, and if you look at the frame time graph, it's massive spikes. It looks pretty bad. So what's going on here? The issue here is VRAM. You can see that at 1080p and 1440p, we're already right around 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and the 5070 only has 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Trying to go to 4K is spilling over. You can see system RAM usage increase, so it's having to spill over the PCIe bus, and that slows everything down. That being said, you can always adjust graphics settings down, and a lot of the settings do impact VRAM. So by going to medium settings here, notice that even at 4K, we could pair this with a 120 Hz display. Again, this is without frame generation, and be doing just fine. 4K medium DLSS performance is around 120 FPS. 1440p medium DLSS balance, we're around 160 FPS, and 1080p medium DLSS quality, almost 190 frames per second. So that is quite a bit of performance there, and I think that's all the tests that I ran for this video. But let's try to make some final conclusions here. Okay, back to record some final thoughts. After I talked to my kids, there was a spider in the bedroom we had to deal with. Anyway, so final thoughts. So let's talk about monitor resolution, right? Because my goal in this video isn't to tell everybody you must buy a 4K display. It's the only thing that makes sense. In fact, there are real reasons why you might not want to pair a GPU with a 4K display. The idea of this video is that monitor resolution used to be the primary decision point on what GPU you bought, and it's a lot more fluid than that now. We have internal rendering resolutions being able to scale all over the place, as well as even monitors coming in dual resolution modes with different frame rates and, you know, your esports mode, all of that. So the point is, that I think you can be less fixated on monitor resolution than perhaps you used to be. And also another one of my points is that by testing only at maximum settings at native resolution, you could often get the idea that a certain graphics card isn't going to give you a good experience on a certain monitor resolution when it actually could do just fine. That being said, though, I think it is important to really pay attention to VRAM specifically when targeting higher resolutions. Because, for example, when we looked at Spider-Man 2 here at max settings, we were not able to get 4K up to a good performance level, even using DLSS performance, because we were still spilling over the VRAM capacity. Now, again, we could turn down other graphics settings and actually still get to a perfectly good experience, but it is the case that increasing resolution of your output does increase the VRAM required. For example, right here, we're at about 8 gigabytes of VRAM at 1080p medium. Here we're allocating just right at it. You might still be okay. And here we're just under 10. So the point is that a particular monitor resolution, if you have an 8 gigabyte card, it can be harder to scale up to higher resolutions. If you have, a 10 or 12 gigabyte card, you can be right on the borderline at 1440p. And I do think for 4K, additional VRAM, things like that, is nice to have. But if you're willing to play below maximum settings, you can certainly still get by on a lot less than you might think. Also, there is the important thing where this video is talking mostly about gaming performance, where I do really think that 1440p is often the sweet spot now. It's important to remember that you may not be using your PC just for gaming. I do a bunch of video editing and a bunch of big spreadsheets and documents and having websites side by side and all of that, and just consuming video content. And a 4K display makes all of that so much better. Whereas it can be a little demanding in games, right? So having all of these scaling options available can mean that if you want to have 4K for work, but still use the same monitor for gaming, it can be a lot more doable than you might think. And having something like, a 1080p, high refresh rate mode, like in the KTC monitor that's sponsored in today's video, that can also be kind of a pretty cool thing, right? Especially if you primarily play esports games and all of that. So I'm not trying to tell you which monitor to buy. I'm trying to tell you that the monitor resolution is less of a, this GPU is only a 1440p GPU, or this GPU is a 4K GPU. This one's a 1080p GPU. Much less segmentation on that than there used to be. But like I said, things like VRAM and overall performance do still play into things and are important considerations. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and you have an excellent day.